A paralyzed Marine had given up hope until his former German Shepherd partner did something no one expected. The wind outside howled through the pine trees like a ghost searching for something it had long lost. The cabin creaked beneath the weight of another bitter winter night, snow pressing against the windows, frost tightening its grip on the world. Inside, Logan Pierce sat in silence, his wheelchair angled toward the empty fireplace, the flames long dead, like the man who sat watching them. At 44, Logan was a ghost of who he once had been. Once a United States Marine, disciplined, fearless, respected. Now he was a man cut in half, paralyzed from the waist down after an improvised explosive device shattered his spine and his future in one blink of flame. Years of therapy, surgeries, false hope, and the hollow sound of "you're lucky to be alive" had left him with nothing but bitterness and dust. He had pushed everyone away. Friends, family, fellow veterans. They had stopped calling. He had stopped caring. His world had shrunk to the size of his cabin, and even that felt too large. Tonight, the pain in his chest was worse than usual, both physical and otherwise. His hand hovered over the small panel on the arm of his wheelchair, where the backup battery for his circulatory support system blinked steadily. One button. That was all it would take. Silence. Rest. No more pretending. No more waiting for hope that would never come. He reached for it. Then came the sound. A thud on the porch. Not wind, not branches. Logan's brows furrowed. Another thump. Then claws scraping against wood. Something pacing just outside the door. He wheeled himself slowly toward it, not out of curiosity but irritation. Probably a coyote, he muttered. He opened the door. Snow rushed in on a gust of wind, but Logan did not notice the cold. Standing in front of him, coated in frost, was a German Shepherd. Tall, powerful, soaked to the bone, breathing hard but standing tall, unmoving. The dog stared straight into Logan's eyes, and something deep inside him cracked. It could not be. No. It was impossible. But he would have known that stare anywhere. Logan's hand trembled. "Hawk?" The dog took one step forward, tail low, ears alert. Then, without hesitation, Hawk pressed his forehead gently against Logan's thigh, right above the faded combat patch sewn onto the edge of his flannel shirt. For the first time in years, Logan could not breathe. His hand found Hawk's fur, still damp and cold but alive, real. And suddenly, that blinking light on his chair's arm no longer mattered. Tears rolled down Logan's face without sound. "You came back," he whispered. And Hawk looked up, eyes sharp and steady as if to say, "I never left." In the silence that followed, a broken man and a lost soldier were whole again. For the mission was not over, not yet. They had named him Subject 107A when he arrived at the rescue facility. Skinny, scarred, and silent. The intake form noted his breed, age, and condition. A German Shepherd, approximately 10 years old, limping on his right hind leg. No collar, no tags. But what truly stood out was the microchip embedded between his shoulders. The technician scanned it out of habit, not expecting much. But when the screen blinked and loaded military data, her heart skipped a beat. The file read, "Canine Hawk, United States Marine Corps, retired." The chip was old, buried under years of forgotten files. But the handler's name was still attached. Staff Sergeant Logan Pierce, the rescue coordinator, made the call the next day. The number rang twice, then went to voicemail. She left a message, polite and direct, explaining they had found a military working dog with his name on file and asked if he would be willing to talk. Logan never called back. 3 days later, Hawk was gone. The fence had been chewed and dug under. Cameras showed him slipping away in the darkness, limping but determined, carrying nothing but instinct and memory. They searched, posted flyers, contacted shelters in the area, but Hawk was moving with the precision of someone on a mission. He had disappeared into the hills. 27 miles away, in the middle of a snowstorm, he appeared on Logan's porch. Logan did not ask how, He did not need to. This was not a coincidence. This was Hawk. The last time they had seen each other was on a dusty road in Afghanistan. Logan had been the team leader, and Hawk had been more than just a canine unit. He was family. On their final mission, an improvised explosive device had gone off beneath Logan's transport. The vehicle flipped, and the world exploded in noise and fire. It was Hawk who had dragged him out. Despite a bleeding flank and a cracked rib cage, Hawk had gripped Logan's vest and pulled him to safety. When medics arrived, Hawk was still crouched over Logan's chest, teeth bared, refusing to let anyone near until they showed their credentials. After that mission, Logan was medically discharged. Hawk, too injured to return to duty, was retired. Paperwork was filed to keep them together, but it got lost. Like many things in the system, Logan thought Hawk had been adopted out, or worse, but now here he was. Hawk did not bark, he did not whine or lick. He simply lay down beside Logan's wheelchair and stayed there, eyes locked forward, muscles still. He did not ask for anything, he was just there. Later that night, Logan sat in his chair, staring at the fire Hawk had helped him find the strength to light. The cabin was quiet except for the soft sound of breathing, his and Hawk's, now in rhythm again. Logan reached down, his hand trembling, and touched the top of Hawk's head. Hawk didn't move. Then, slowly, he turned his head, looked into Logan's eyes, and lifted his front paw. He placed it gently on Logan's thigh. It was not random. It was a signal, a memory. The same gesture he had used before every mission, awaiting command. Logan covered his face and wept. Not from pain, but from something he had not felt in years. Belonging. Purpose. The mission was still on, and Hawk was still waiting. The first change was the morning. For years Logan had ignored the sunrise, sleeping through most of the day or lying awake in darkness, refusing to care. But Hawk would not allow it. At precisely 6 a.m. every day, without fail, Hawk would nudge Logan's arm. If Logan ignored him, Hawk would gently tap the side of the wheelchair with his paw. When that failed, he barked once, low, firm, commanding. Logan started getting up. At first it was just to shut the dog up. Then it became routine. Hawk would sit by the door, tail thudding, leash in his mouth. Logan had not used the ramp outside in months. Now every morning they rolled down it together, Logan in his chair, Hawk just off his left wheel, walking perfectly in sync, the same position he had taken during missions. It was muscle memory for both of them. Logan noticed other changes too. If he skipped breakfast, Hawk would sit across the table from him, eyes unwavering. When Logan pushed the food away, Hawk would push it back with his nose. The message was clear. Eat, survive, keep going. Something inside Logan shifted. He began attending his virtual physical therapy appointments again, then in person. He practiced lifting himself into the chair. He relearned stretches, not because he wanted to walk again, but because Hawk was watching. And for some reason he could not stand the thought of disappointing the dog who had crossed mountains to find him. Word spread around the neighborhood. Children would ride by on bikes and stop at the gate, pointing and whispering, "That's the Marine and his dog." Hawk, once a ghost in fur, now sat calmly when kids asked to pet him. He let them touch his ears, even leaned into their hands. But his eyes always tracked Logan, never more than a few feet away, always between his handler and the world. At night, Logan began to sleep again. Until the nightmares came. Flashes of fire, screams, dust, a burning truck, the sound of bones snapping. When it happened, Logan would jolt awake, soaked in sweat, gasping for air. And always Hawk was there. He never barked, never panicked. He would climb onto the bed and press his weight gently against Logan's chest, then raise a paw and tap, soft, rhythmic, just enough to bring him back to the present, back to safety. One day, the local veterans center invited Logan to a small gathering. He hesitated. But Hawk stood by the door that morning, tail still, waiting. So they went. The room was full of men and women who had seen too much and said too little. Some were in chairs like Logan. Others leaned on canes. All carried something invisible. When it was Logan's turn to speak, he froze. Then Hawk stepped forward. Without command, he took the handle of Logan's chair and pulled, gently but firmly, out to the center of the room. The room fell silent. Logan grabbed the frame of a walker nearby, breath held, arms trembling, and stood. 1 step, 2, 3. Hawk moved beside him, pacing evenly, alert, as if clearing a path. Someone clapped, then another, then everyone. Logan turned toward the crowd, blinking away tears. "I could not walk alone," he said quietly, "but I never really had to." Hawk sat beside him, head high, watching every face. For the first time in years, Logan did not feel broken. He felt seen, and not as a crippled soldier, but as a man who had come back from the dead, because someone never gave up on him. It was a crisp spring morning when it happened. Logan and Hawk had made the walk to the park like they did every Thursday. Logan pushing himself along the paved path in his wheelchair, Hawk moving in steady rhythm just off his left wheel, ears up, tail relaxed. The routine had become sacred, predictable, healing. Until it wasn't. They had reached the far end of the park trail when Logan paused to stretch his shoulders. He leaned forward slightly, and then nothing. His body slumped, arms twitching, eyes wide but unfocused. A stroke. Sudden, silent, dangerous. The emergency alert device on Logan's chair flickered, struggling to connect. The signal was weak in that part of the park, and no one was nearby. But Hawk was. Before the device could even emit a full warning beep, Hawk moved. He ran, not with the speed of his youth, but with the purpose of a soldier answering a call. He sprinted toward the park entrance, onto the sidewalk, and straight into traffic. Horns blared, tires screeched, but Hawk stood his ground, barking loudly, leaping toward a woman's car window and pawing at the glass. At first she panicked, but then she saw the service tag on his harness and the desperation in his eyes. She followed him. When they reached Logan, he was seizing. Paramedics arrived just minutes later. One looked at the woman and said, "You got him here in time. Another 5 minutes and—" He didn't finish the sentence. At the hospital, Logan recovered, slowly, painfully, but he was alive. Hawk waited outside the intensive care unit room for nearly 2 days, refusing food, refusing to lie down. Then, just as Logan was being discharged, Hawk collapsed at the doorway. His breathing was labored. His eyes, still sharp, showed pain he tried to mask. Tests confirmed what Logan feared, a large abdominal tumor pressing against vital organs. It was operable, but costly, aggressive, dangerous. Logan did not hesitate. He sold his car, cleared out a savings account meant for home modifications. "He saved my life more than once," he told the vet. "This is not charity, it's repayment." The surgery went well, but recovery was long. Hawk moved slower now, sometimes favoring his right side. His bark was softer. But his eyes? They still burned with that unwavering resolve. Weeks later, the town held a ceremony for military and service animals. The local veterans group insisted Hawk be honored. The mayor came. So did children from nearby schools, each holding a sign that read, "Thank you, Hawk." Logan wheeled himself onto the stage, Hawk at his side in a decorated service vest. The applause was thunderous. He took a breath, placed a hand gently on Hawk's back, and leaned into the microphone. Most people think Hawk is a dog, a tool, a helper, but they're wrong. The room quieted. "He's a soldier, my brother in arms. The one who didn't just save my body, but saved the parts of me I thought were lost. The man I used to be, the will I had abandoned." He paused, glancing down at Hawk. "And even now, while I recover, he's still watching over me. Slower, maybe, older, but with the same fire in his eyes." His voice cracked. "Hawk is not a pet. He is a warrior. He never stopped serving, and because of him, I never stopped living." The crowd rose to their feet. Hawk stood still beside him, posture tall, chest lifted, as if he knew exactly what was being said. A soldier to the very end, still on mission, still fighting, for one man's soul. The afternoon Hawk passed. Logan had brought his chair out onto the porch like he always did, the wheels creaking faintly over the old boards. Hawk lay beside him in the tall grass, his gray-touched fur blending into the earth, breathing slow and steady. His eyes, still sharp as ever, remained fixed on the horizon, watching, as if expecting something only he could see. Logan reached down, resting a weathered hand gently on Hawk's head. "You can rest now, old boy," he said, voice quiet. "You did more than enough." Hawk didn't move, but his breathing eased, deepened, then fell still. His head remained on Logan's boot, eyes open, gaze calm, as if he had chosen to keep watch just a little longer, just in case. Logan sat with him for hours, the light fading, the air cooling. Not speaking, just remembering. The next day, Logan buried Hawk beneath the large oak tree behind the cabin, the same place Hawk had loved to nap in the fall sun. He folded a small American flag and placed it beside the collar that had seen war, recovery, and something far greater, redemption. The headstone was simple, hand-carved with care. Hawk, loyal beyond orders, silent till the end. No eulogy was spoken, none was needed, but the town noticed. Neighbors brought flowers. A local veteran carved a wooden eagle and placed it at the base of the tree. Children left drawings of Hawk with wings. Letters arrived from across the country. Veterans, therapists, survivors, all of them saying the same thing. "Your story gave me strength." In the weeks that followed, Logan returned to the Veterans Center, not as a patient, but as a guide. He trained others like him, men and women with broken bodies, invisible wounds, and fading willpower. He understood them, not because of what he had studied, but because of what Hawk had taught him. He started writing at night, page after page. By spring, he had a finished manuscript. The Hawk Who Stayed. It was not just a tribute, it was a roadmap for those who had lost purpose, for those searching for one reason to keep going. In the dedication he wrote, "To the soldier who never asked for a command, who showed up, who stayed, who stood between me and the end. You were never just a dog. You were the reason I kept breathing." At the final page, one last line stood alone. He did not ask for a command. He just showed up. And that saved my life. If the story of Logan and Hawk moved you, you're not alone. What began with a silent knock on the door became a powerful reminder that the deepest loyalty often comes from those who cannot speak, but understand everything. Hawk was not just a dog. He was a soldier, a healer, a brother who showed up, stood guard, and stayed until the very end. At Amazing Paws Stories, we honor true stories like this, about second chances, unseen heroes, and the unbreakable bond between people and the animals who save them in the quietest ways. Subscribe to Amazing Paws Stories to discover more stories of love, sacrifice, and hope that will stay with you long after the screen fades to black. Click subscribe, share this story with someone who needs a little courage today, and remember, sometimes the hero is not the one who gives the command, but the one who never left your side.
8 testimonies buried. 1 girl vanished. No trace, no trial, no truth. A bracelet hidden in the floorboards. A rusted keychain lost in snow. A box of memories no one dared open. For 12 long winters, silence ruled, until one canine dog broke it. He didn't bark for orders, he didn't bark for treats, he barked for justice. And the young officer who followed him, pure-hearted, unshaken, had no idea his new assignment would unravel the darkest secret of a town frozen in denial. The man everyone trusted was the man who buried the truth. But this time, the snow couldn't hide it. This time, Echo barked, and the truth rose like thunder. What happens next will haunt you, heal you, and maybe restore your faith in what one dog can do. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. I want to see how far this story echoes. And if you believe every animal has a voice worth hearing, hit that subscribe button. Because what you're about to witness isn't just a story, it's a reckoning. The wind rolled down from the mountains like a forgotten prayer, biting and bitter. Snow Ridge, Colorado, sat quiet under a pale gray sky, its streets carved through snowbanks taller than most cars. This was a town of silence, the kind that crept beneath your coat and settled in your bones. But silence, Nate Carter would soon learn, wasn't always empty. It was often hiding something. Nate Carter, 31, stepped out of his black patrol SUV and onto the ice-packed lot outside the Snow Ridge Police Department. Tall and lean, with a wiry build earned from years of field work, he carried the kind of calm intensity that made people lower their voices when he walked into a room. His hazel eyes were sharp, but not unkind, and his square jaw often clenched when he was thinking. Nate had served in Denver PD's Special Crimes Division before requesting a transfer. Not because he couldn't handle the pressure, he could, but because something about the city had started to eat away at him. Too many cases where justice got twisted. Too many suits shaking hands while families buried daughters. So when Snow Ridge offered a quieter post, Nate took it. He didn't expect quiet to mean so much snow. Inside the station, warmth fought with the cold that clung to the edges of the old wooden windows. A woman with short blonde hair and sharp cheekbones approached him, clipboard in hand. "You must be Carter, Deputy Carla Monroe," she said with a nod. Carla was in her late 30s, tall and composed, her voice brisk but not unfriendly. Her uniform was pressed perfectly, and her boots were polished, a habit from her days in the state police. She was known in town for her precision and her tendency to keep personal things locked tighter than the evidence room. Locals said she'd once lost a fiancé in a drunk driving crash just weeks before their wedding, and since then, her smile never quite reached her eyes. Carla gestured toward the kennel room. "Let's introduce you to your partner." Behind a steel-meshed door, the German Shepherd stood motionless, eyes locked on Nate before he even stepped in. His coat was a deep charcoal black with tan markings, thick and slightly matted near the shoulders. His left ear had a permanent tilt, like it had once been broken and never healed properly. The nameplate on the door read Echo. "He's 4, Carla said, watching Nate's reaction. "Former canine in Denver, bomb detection and tracking. Brilliant, but he was pulled after an incident during a raid. No physical injury, but ever since he's been different. Won't respond to most handlers." Nate knelt down slowly, letting Echo sniff his hand. The dog leaned forward, nose twitching, then made a soft sound in his throat, somewhere between a growl and a whimper. "That's more than he did for the last guy," Carla muttered. "Might be he likes you." Nate's hand brushed the dog's fur. Or maybe he's just being polite. That afternoon, Nate met the man who ran the station, Chief Roy Hensley. Roy was in his late 50s, his once broad shoulders now softened by age but still carrying the posture of authority. He had silver-streaked hair, combed back tightly, and wore a long navy coat with polished brass buttons. His handshake was firm, but his eyes, steel blue, held a weight, like someone who had learned long ago to keep secrets better than files. "Glad to have you here, Carter," Roy said, clapping Nate's shoulder. "We like quiet in Snow Ridge. Hope you're okay with slow days." "I don't mind quiet," Nate replied. "Just don't like loose ends." Roy chuckled. "Don't we all?" As they walked past, Echo's eyes tracked Roy sharply. When the chief turned his back, the dog let out a deep, guttural growl. It lasted only a second. Roy paused, glanced back, but didn't say anything. "That's strange," Carla murmured after Roy left. "Echoes never reacted like that, not even to strangers." Nate didn't answer, but his eyes lingered on the chief's retreating figure longer than necessary. That evening, Nate settled into his small office, unpacking boxes of case files and personal items. While organizing old department files to understand the town's crime history, a yellowed folder caught his attention. Melissa Kane. Missing Person Report, 2011. He flipped through it. Melissa had been 19, a college intern working part-time at the station. The last person to see her alive? Listed as Roy Hensley, then acting deputy. She had left work late, was never seen again. No signs of struggle. Case marked inactive, insufficient evidence. What stood out wasn't the details. It was what was missing. No follow-ups, no witness interviews beyond Roy's. The file had been closed 2 weeks after Roy became chief. Nate closed the folder slowly, his fingers tightening around the paper edges. Outside, the wind picked up again, howling against the windows. Echo, resting in his corner, suddenly stood and faced the office door, ears perked and body tense. Nate followed the dog's gaze. Nothing there. But the silence felt heavier than before. The morning fog still clung to the pine-covered ridges around Snow Ridge, hanging like a veil over the frozen town. A soft snow had fallen overnight, leaving a pristine white coat over the streets and rooftops. The air was sharp with the kind of cold that made breath visible, like secrets trying to escape the body. Nate Carter walked toward the police station with Echo at his side, the dog's gait alert, ears pricked forward. Something was different today. Echo's energy, once wary, now simmered with subtle tension. Inside the station, the heater clanked loudly as it struggled against the cold. Nate passed the front desk, nodded at Deputy Carla Monroe, and headed down the hall toward the evidence wing. He had one goal that morning: to understand why Echo had reacted so violently to Roy Hensley the day before. There had to be something the dog was picking up, some scent, some echo of emotion. Nate didn't believe in ghosts, but he believed in instincts. Echo had been trained to pick up fear, blood, chemical residue, and in some cases, residual human emotion in trauma spaces. That was how good he had once been. As Nate passed the old stairwell to the basement, Echo abruptly stopped. His muscles stiffened, his tail low but alert. A second later, he let out a deep, chest-borne bark that echoed through the hallway. Nate turned to see him staring down the stairwell, ears flat now, growling low. The basement. Nate remembered that Roy had casually mentioned months ago that the lower storage had been sealed off due to old plumbing and insulation issues. No one went down there anymore, not even Carla. The door to the stairwell had a rusted padlock on it and a faded sign that read, "Restricted. Authorized personnel only." "Echo," Nate said quietly. "What do you smell?" The dog sniffed toward the doorframe, pawing once at the baseboard, then growled again. Lower this time, more focused. Nate reached out and jiggled the lock. It was old, but functional. He made a mental note to ask Carla for keys, or find another way. But before doing anything else, he needed more context. History. Later that afternoon, Nate visited the Snow Ridge Town Archive, a red-bricked building tucked beside the frozen library square. Inside, it smelled of dust, old paper, and wood polish. Shelves rose like thin spines of forgotten stories. Behind the counter sat an elderly woman with silver curls pinned neatly under a knit blue beret. Her name tag read, Sarah Mendenhall. Sarah was in her late 70s, small-framed and always layered in thick wool sweaters. Her eyes, though faded with age, still flickered with sharp memory. She had been the town's record keeper and librarian for over 40 years. Locals said Sarah could recite every mayor's term and every family's genealogy going back 3 generations. A stroke 10 years earlier had slowed her walk and stiffened her left hand, but it hadn't dulled her mind. "Can I help you, dear?" she asked, looking up. Nate smiled. "I'm Officer Carter. I'm looking into an old case, Melissa Kane, disappeared in 2011. I heard you might remember what was stored in the archives back then." Sarah's smile faded. "Melissa," she said softly. "That sweet girl with the red scarf. She always brought me chamomile tea when she came by to file documents." Nate leaned forward slightly. "Do you remember what happened when she went missing?" Sarah exhaled slowly. "I remember the fear, and I remember Chief Hensley, back then just Deputy Roy, came by the archives 2 days after she was declared missing. Said he needed to keep her personal effects somewhere secure. He had a brown box with her name on it." Nate's brow furrowed. "Did he store it here?" Sarah shook her head. "No, he said he'd take it himself, until the evidence room had space. But that box, it never came back, and there's no record of it in our logs. I asked about it twice, but Roy said it had been handled." "Do you remember what was in it?" "A bracelet, a notebook with poems, a photo of her and her little brother, and a small music player she used to carry everywhere." Sarah paused. "Funny thing was, Melissa hated country music, but that box was playing an old Johnny Cash song when he picked it up." Nate thanked her, heart pounding, and stepped outside into the snow. The cold slapped him, but his mind was elsewhere. If Roy had taken Melissa's belongings, and they were never filed, where had they gone? Why hide a music player and a bracelet, unless those things told a story he didn't want told? Back at the station, Nate returned to the stairwell with Carla. "You sure about this?" she asked, holding the spare key. "That basement hasn't been opened in years. Roy had it sealed himself, said it was mold and old wiring." "Mold doesn't make dogs bark like that," Nate replied. She handed him the key. The lock clicked open. The hinges groaned as the door swung inward, revealing darkness and the sharp metallic scent of time. Echo stood at the threshold, unmoving, ears flat again. Then he stepped forward, slowly. The basement was narrow and damp, lined with old filing cabinets, broken shelves, and yellowing boxes stacked carelessly. Nate flipped on his flashlight and followed Echo's path as the dog weaved through debris like a bloodhound. Then he stopped, dead still, in front of a shelf near the far wall. Echo sat, staring. There, wedged behind some old insulation boards, was a cardboard box. It was coated in dust, one corner chewed through by mice, but faintly written in faded marker was the name, Kane, Melissa. Nate's heart thudded. He pulled it free, brushed it off, and opened it slowly. Inside, a tarnished silver bracelet, a dried flower tucked into a folded napkin, and a red spiral-bound notebook with curled pages. No photo, no music player. But at the bottom, beneath a thin layer of paper shavings, lay a police badge. It was old. The number had been filed off. Echo gave a soft whine and nudged the notebook with his nose. Nate turned it over. The back page was torn, but a sentence remained in blue ink. "He said he'd drive me home tonight. I think he's been watching me." The snow that fell that morning had a weight to it, not just in inches, but in feeling. The flakes came down steadily, not in flurries, but in a slow, deliberate rhythm, like the sky was taking its time covering up what the earth refused to forget. By mid-afternoon, the trees behind Snow Ridge looked dipped in powdered sugar, their limbs silent and bent low. Nate Carter sat behind the wheel of his patrol SUV, Echo at his side, as they turned off the last stretch of cleared road onto a narrower path toward the woods. Patrols in Snow Ridge were more of a routine formality than a necessity. Crime here came soft and rare. Petty thefts, a drunk driver in spring, the occasional black bear rummaging through trash. But today, Nate had asked to go alone, to think. And Echo? Echo had been unsettled since the night before. It had started exactly at 2:16 a.m. Nate had been asleep, cocooned under 2 heavy quilts in the small log cabin he was renting on the south edge of town. Echo slept in the same room on a thick dog mat by the heater, but when the clock blinked 2:16, Echo let out a sound Nate had never heard before. Not a bark, not a growl, but a low, wavering howl. His body stayed still, head tilted upward, as if responding to something no one else could hear. Nate had jolted awake, disoriented, heart thudding. It happened again the next night. Same time, same sound. Nate had checked the windows, even stepped outside barefoot onto the porch, rifle in hand. Nothing but snow, wind, and the echo of that mournful cry. Now, Echo sat upright in the passenger seat, ears forward, body leaning as if pulled by some invisible thread. Nate noticed the tension return to the dog's shoulders, the kind he showed only when on active track. "You got something?" Nate asked. Echo whined and scratched at the door. Nate opened it, and the German Shepherd leapt out, nose to the wind. He moved with purpose, tail stiff and steady, weaving through thin trees, crunching fresh snow beneath his paws. Nate followed, grabbing his flashlight, boots sinking into the drifts. They crossed a frozen trailhead and descended toward a shallow slope behind the old logging route. Nate knew this stretch. Locals called it Whisper's Bend, where the river bent sharply behind the ridge. It was secluded, quiet, and often forgotten. Echo stopped near the banks of the half-frozen stream, his nose inches from the ground. He pawed at something beneath a crust of ice and leaves, then looked back at Nate, letting out a short, urgent bark. Nate knelt beside him. The object glinted faintly under the beam of his flashlight, a rusted bit of metal sealed inside a small, cloudy plastic bag. Gently, Nate pulled it free and brushed away the grime. It was a heart-shaped keychain, the kind teenagers clip to backpacks or diaries. Faded lettering across the surface read, "Melissa," in swirling font. Inside the bag, it had been wrapped in a strip of old cloth. Someone had tried to preserve it, or hide it. Echo sat silently now, ears flicking but body calm. Nate pocketed the bag, zipped it into his coat, and looked around. No footprints, no signs of movement. But something about the placement, the way the bag had been wedged beneath stone and soil, felt deliberate. He didn't radio it in. Instead, back at the station, he placed the item in a separate envelope marked with a false inventory tag. He trusted Carla, but until he understood the shape of the shadows around this case, he needed to keep one step ahead. He'd send the keychain to a private contact at the Denver Crime Lab tomorrow. It would be better that way. That night, the third night in a row, Echo howled again at 2:16 a.m. Nate sat up in bed already awake, staring at the glowing clock face. Echo didn't move from his mat. He just lifted his snout, eyes wide open, and released the sound again. Longer this time, broken, like a voice crying through fog. It sent chills up Nate's spine. Sleep didn't come easy after that. When Nate finally drifted off before dawn, his dreams were fragmented. A woman with red hair stood in the forest, barefoot in the snow. She held something in her hand, something shining, and said, "I didn't want to go with him." Then her eyes widened in terror. A shadow approached behind her. Nate reached out, but the image splintered. He awoke in sweat. By morning, Nate sat at the kitchen table with coffee gone cold, staring at the envelope containing the keychain. Echo lay nearby, awake, watching him with unblinking eyes. Outside, snow fell again. Light, persistent. The kind of snow that doesn't smother. It remembers. Snow Ridge's wind was sharper than usual that morning, slicing through layers of flannel and fleece like it had something to say. The gray skies hung low and heavy, and the streetlights flickered even though the sun was technically up. Nate Carter stepped into the police station with Echo by his side, their boots and paws leaving wet tracks behind them. But Echo moved differently today, not with nervous energy but focused purpose. His eyes were locked ahead, like something was pulling him forward from memory. Nate had barely finished unzipping his coat when Echo broke away and bolted down the east hallway, toward the old records room. "Echo!" Nate called, but the German Shepherd didn't stop. Nate hurried after him. The records room sat behind a narrow, warped door, one few officers ever entered anymore. It had been used for long-retired case files, old supply logs, and broken furniture too stubborn to throw away. Most didn't have a key. Nate did. He unlocked the door, and Echo shoved it open with his nose, darting in with surprising urgency. Dust puffed into the air as the dog sniffed wildly, circling a pair of stacked file cabinets and weaving around a sagging desk in the corner. The room was dim and stale, walls lined with metal shelves and crooked boxes with fading labels. In one corner, tucked under an old cloth-draped table, stood a rust-colored filing desk, its surface coated in grime. Echo stopped in front of it, sat down, and began barking. Short, rhythmic, unwavering. Nate approached. The desk drawer was locked. He tugged gently, nothing. Echo let out another bark and placed both front paws on the drawer, then looked up at Nate with intense, pleading eyes. Nate grabbed a thin screwdriver from the nearby supply bin, wedged it into the lock, and gave it a sharp twist. The mechanism snapped with a tired clink. Inside, beneath a tangle of yellowing folders, lay a dark cloth bundle. Nate pulled it free. It was a square of fabric, flannel, torn from a sleeve maybe, and stiff in places where blood had long since dried. Echo gave a low, mournful sound and lay down across the threshold of the records room, positioning his body squarely between Nate and the door. Moments later, the door creaked open. Roy Hensley stepped inside, his broad frame filling the entrance. He wore his Navy patrol coat, collar up, snow clinging to the shoulders. His face was composed, but his eyes darted to Echo, then to the cloth in Nate's hand. "What's going on here?" Roy asked calmly, though his voice held an edge. "Echo found this," Nate said evenly, not rising from his crouch. "In a locked drawer no one has touched in years." Roy's brow twitched. "That desk was used by evidence clerks a decade ago. Could have belonged to anyone." Echo stood, stiffened, and let out a sharp bark, positioning himself directly between Roy and Nate again. The tension crackled like frost underfoot. "I'll log it and check the records," Nate said, folding the fabric carefully into a clean evidence bag. "Just covering all angles." Roy gave a tight nod, lingered a moment longer, then turned and walked away. As soon as he was gone, Nate knelt beside Echo. "Good boy," he whispered. Echo's tail didn't wag. His eyes stayed fixed on the empty doorway, as if the conversation wasn't over. That night, Nate made a call. Across the state in Denver, Dr. Leo Chen picked up on the second ring. Leo was a forensic analyst in his mid-30s with a soft voice and a habit of tapping pens when he thought. He was of Taiwanese descent, short, with thick-rimmed glasses and a dry sense of humor that had once gotten him suspended for impersonating a superior officer on April Fool's Day. Leo had known Nate since academy training. They didn't talk often, but when they did, there was trust. Solid, unshakable. "You're not supposed to be calling me on this line," Leo said immediately. "I know," Nate replied, "but I've got something I need eyes on. Quietly." Leo sighed. "What is it?" "Dried blood on fabric. I need to know if it matches a missing person. Melissa Kane, disappeared from Snow Ridge in 2011. There was a pause, then, "That name's familiar. Thought her case was closed." "It wasn't closed," Nate said. "It was buried." "I'll text you a secure drop address," Leo said. "Send it now, and I'll get you something in 24 hours. The next day, Nate watched the package leave Snow Ridge via courier, nestled between bubble wrap and sealed under 3 layers of tamper-proof tape. Echo sat quietly by the window, watching the truck disappear into the snowy horizon. His ears flicked again at 2:16 a.m. that night, but this time there was no howl, only stillness, like the air itself was holding its breath. Exactly 24 hours later, Nate's burner phone buzzed with a single message. "DNA match. The blood is Melissa Kane's. No doubt." LC. Echo stood up without being called. He walked across the room, nudged Nate's arm once with his nose, then rested his chin on Nate's lap. Snow Ridge wore a coat of brittle frost that morning, thin and hard like glass, covering even the smallest branch and wire fence. The roads crackled under Nate Carter's tires as he pulled into the police station. Echo seated silently beside him. The dog hadn't howled again since the DNA results arrived, but his behavior had shifted. He was more alert, more tethered to Nate's every move. as if now that the truth had begun to surface, his instincts sharpened further. Nate stepped inside the station's briefing room to find Chief Roy Hensley waiting, hands folded on the table, face calm but eyes hard. A mug of coffee steamed beside him, untouched. "Have a seat, Officer Carter," Roy said, his voice even. Nate remained standing. Roy exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. "You've been asking a lot of questions lately. Visiting old files, opening rooms we had closed for a reason. I thought we had an understanding about how things are run here." Nate said nothing. Roy's fingers drummed once against the table. "Did you find something in that drawer?" Nate met his gaze. "Only dust and neglect." Roy studied him. "That dog of yours, he doesn't seem to like me." "He doesn't seem to like a lot of people," Nate replied coolly. "But he doesn't usually growl unless he senses something." As if on cue, Echo, who had been lying near the door, rose slowly to his feet. His gaze locked on Roy. In a flash, he stepped forward and sank his teeth, not deep, but firmly, into the hem of Roy's left pant leg. Roy froze. Echo didn't pull or growl, just held. Nate reacted instantly. "Echo! Out!" Echo released at once and returned to Nate's side, tail still, gaze never leaving the chief. Roy's face had gone pale. He stepped back, smoothing the leg of his trousers where the fabric now bore faint teeth marks. "That dog's got issues." "He's got instincts," Nate said, "and sometimes they're more honest than people." Roy studied him again. Something in his eyes shifted. Not fear, unease. A fracture in the confidence he wore like a second skin. "I don't like secrets in my department," he said softly. "Neither do I," Nate replied. Roy left the room without another word. That afternoon, Nate took Echo and drove north, following the unmarked mountain road that curved behind the ridgeline. The air grew colder, the trees older and closer together. After 15 miles, he reached a small A-frame cabin with smoke curling from a crooked chimney. A pickup truck sat out front, half covered in snow. The mailbox read Kane in chipped black letters. Andrew Kane answered the door wearing a red flannel shirt, beard thick and touched with silver. He stood in his early 40s, tall, weathered by mountain life, with the calm steadiness of a man who'd learned to survive without expecting anything from the world. His eyes lingered on Echo. "That your dog?" "Canine unit," Nate said. "Name's Echo. He's the reason I'm here." Andrew opened the door wider. "Come in. Fire's going." Inside, the cabin smelled of pine and cedar. Mounted antlers lined the wall above a stone hearth. Andrew poured black coffee into 2 mismatched mugs and handed one to Nate. "You're here about Melissa," he said, sitting opposite. "A cop showing up 12 years later usually means something new's been found." Nate nodded. "I found a piece of cloth, with her blood on it, hidden in the police station." Andrew's jaw tightened. "I knew it." "Knew what?" "That it wasn't random. Melissa never went hiking. She wasn't the type to vanish into the woods and die quietly, but they told me she must have wandered off, that she was stressed, maybe took her own life." "She ever talk about anyone at the station making her uncomfortable?" Andrew looked into the fire. "She didn't say it, but she avoided night shifts. Said there were eyes that lingered too long. Said one guy offered to drive her home more than once even when she said no." "Who?" Andrew hesitated, then said quietly, "Deputy Hensley. He was always around when she stayed late. She told me once she felt watched. I should have pushed harder, but back then, I didn't want to make trouble." Nate took a deep breath. The last entry in her notebook said she was getting a ride home, the night she disappeared. Andrew stood and walked to a nearby shelf, pulling down a small photo frame. He handed it to Nate. It showed Melissa at 19, smiling, wearing a red scarf and holding a steaming cup of cider. Her eyes were bright, her hand resting on Andrew's shoulder. In the background stood the old Snow Ridge Christmas tree, lit against the cold. "I've kept that photo out every day since she disappeared," Andrew said, "so she doesn't vanish again." Echo walked forward then, without prompting, and laid his head on Andrew's knee. The older man froze, hand instinctively reaching to touch the dog's head. For a second, his rough exterior cracked. His hand trembled. "She trusted people too easily," Andrew said, voice low, but not anymore. Snow Ridge sat under a heavy gray hush that day, the kind of silence that made the air feel thicker, as if the clouds were pressing down on the town. Snow flurried in loose spirals, catching on tree branches and power lines, but not settling. Inside the police station, the heaters hummed low and tired, filling the halls with a dry warmth that barely touched the walls. Nate Carter was halfway through updating his report on the Melissa Kane investigation, at least the parts he could officially include, when Echo rose abruptly from his spot by the filing cabinet. The German Shepherd stood stiff, ears forward, body tense. His eyes locked on the hallway. "You hear something?" Nate asked, pausing. Echo didn't bark. He just turned and walked out of the office, steady and certain. Nate followed without grabbing his coat. The dog led him to the back stairwell, narrow, dusty, and barely used. It spiraled upward to the rooftop terrace above the station's west wing. The rooftop had been sealed off for years due to structural concerns, but the door wasn't locked, just rusted into place. Echo growled low, pushing at it with his shoulder. Nate forced the door open. It scraped the floor with a painful screech and opened into the rooftop, where snow blew in sideways and ice crackled beneath every step. The terrace was bare save for some rusted vent pipes and an old antenna bolted into a concrete slab. Echo stepped out into the cold, nose to the ground, his movements purposeful. His body followed a curved path along the edge of the rooftop until he reached a corner where the cement had darkened. Cracked with time, rough and uneven. There he stopped. He sniffed, whined, then barked sharply. One bark, two. Nate knelt beside him. Echo scratched at the concrete floor, claws scraping against the rough surface. A faint line, a seam in the cement, caught Nate's attention, like something had been poured here separately from the rest. A repair patch. Old, but not as old as the rest of the rooftop. "What are you trying to tell me?" Nate murmured. He stood and returned moments later with a pry bar and chisel from the maintenance closet. Echo sat nearby, still and watchful. The cement took effort to crack. It wasn't professional work, just a shallow, rushed layer over something hastily buried. After 15 minutes, the chisel struck metal. Nate's hands trembled as he scraped away the last of the dust. Beneath the slab was a small tin container. Rusted, dented. Inside, wrapped in a waxy cloth, lay a silver bracelet. Nate unwrapped it slowly. The name etched into the thin metal was worn, but still readable. To M.K., stay brave, Dad. Nate stared at it in silence, his breath fogging in the cold air. This wasn't a random item. This wasn't misplaced. It had been buried here, beneath cement, on the rooftop of a police station. Echo pressed his nose to the bracelet once, then sat back, eyes solemn. That afternoon, Nate sat in the break room, turning the evidence bag over in his hands. The silver glinted faintly under the fluorescent lights. Carla Monroe entered, pulling off her gloves, snow dusting the shoulders of her navy uniform. She paused when she saw his expression. "Something else?" "I found it," Nate said, holding the bracelet up, buried under a patch of cement on the rooftop. Carla raised her eyebrows. "On the roof?" "He poured over it," Nate replied. "Tried to hide it for good." She pulled out a chair and sat. "You think it's hers?" "It has her initials, a message from her dad. Echo led me straight to it." Carla shook her head slowly, her voice low. "Why there?" "Probably somewhere he thought no one would look. No one goes up there anymore." Carla looked down at the table. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her. "There was something else I never told anyone. Years ago, Roy disappeared for 2 weeks. Said it was vacation time, but there were rumors." Nate leaned in. "What kind of rumors?" Carla hesitated. "That he had a fight, a violent one, with a woman in the department. Some said it was in the parking lot. Others said it happened after hours, on the 3rd floor. Either way, no names were recorded. She was gone by the next week. You think it was Melissa? I don't know, but she never came back, and that's not coincidence. Nate's mind was already racing. If Roy had a history of conflict with female staff, and if Melissa had been pressured, it could explain why she never told anyone, why she kept it in a journal instead. That night, back at the cabin, Nate placed the bracelet beside the keychain and fabric scrap. Pieces of Melissa's story. Echo curled up near the fireplace, but his eyes stayed open, tracking the bracelet like it might vanish again. At 2:16 a.m., Echo stood and faced the window. He didn't bark, he didn't growl. He simply stared into the darkness outside, ears stiff, tail still. Something was coming, and this time they'd be ready. Snow Ridge had gone eerily quiet by late afternoon. The wind that usually hissed between the pine trees had died, and the sky had turned a sickly steel gray, neither night nor day. Inside the police station, the walls seemed to close in with the cold, each hallway muffled as though the building itself was bracing for something it didn't want to hear. Nate Carter entered the internal conference room carrying a thin file folder and 2 clear evidence bags. He wasn't in uniform, just a dark wool sweater, worn jeans, and boots still dusted in rooftop snow. Echo padded behind him, his large frame calm but alert, tail lowered, eyes locked ahead. Roy Hensley was already waiting, seated at the end of the long oak table. He looked tired. His usually crisp uniform jacket was unbuttoned, sleeves wrinkled. There was a tremble in his hand as he adjusted his reading glasses. The air between them held the heavy stillness of an interrogation yet to begin. Nate placed the file down without a word, followed by the 2 bags, one containing the silver bracelet, the other the heart-shaped keychain with Melissa written in worn cursive. The metal glinted beneath the fluorescent lights. Echo stepped forward and sat between them, right at the head of the table. He didn't move again. Roy looked at the items but didn't reach for them. Where did you find those? On the roof, Nate said, buried in concrete. Echo found it, just like he found the cloth with Melissa's blood in that drawer you kept locked. Roy's jaw clenched. That doesn't prove anything. Nate took a breath. I think it proves a lot. The bracelet was from her father. The keychain, she carried that every day. You knew it too. That's why you kept them. That's why you couldn't throw them away. Roy looked up, but his voice was brittle. I don't know what you're implying. I think you do. Nate leaned forward. She trusted you. She stayed late because she thought she'd be safe, but something happened, and you buried the truth. Echo let out a single, deep bark, sharp, echoing off the cold walls. Roy flinched. Echo rose slowly to his feet and moved to stand directly between Nate and the chief. His posture was rigid, protective. His eyes locked onto Roy's, unmoving. Roy's voice broke. I didn't mean to kill her. Silence. The words hung there like frost suspended in air. Nate didn't move. Echo didn't blink. Roy swallowed hard, as if forcing the rest out of his throat. She said no. I'd been drinking. Not much, but enough. I offered to drive her home. She was upset. She threatened to report me. His hands shook now. I grabbed her wrist just to stop her from walking away, but she pulled back, slipped. Her head hit the concrete. He closed his eyes. She wasn't breathing. I panicked. I thought no one would believe me, so I took the body. I didn't bury it at first. I just hid it. Then I hid the bracelet. I didn't know what else to do. The room was still. Even the heating system seemed to go silent. Then the door opened. Andrew Kane stepped in without knocking. His tall frame filled the doorway, his coat still streaked with snow. He hadn't shaved in days, and his eyes were dark with the weight of too many nights without sleep. He looked at Roy, then at Nate, and then at the table. I want to hear it, he said. All of it. Roy's shoulders sagged like a man aging by the second. She slipped. I didn't push her. I swear to you, Andrew. But I covered it up. I didn't tell anyone. I buried the pieces one at a time. First her notebook, then the bracelet. I poured concrete over it like it would bury the guilt. Tears ran freely now, down the weathered lines of Roy's face. I've heard her in my sleep for 12 years. I thought if I kept silent it would fade, but it didn't. And now she's screaming. Echo stepped away from the table and lay down near the wall, but his eyes never left Roy. Andrew's voice, when it came, was low. You told me she ran away, that she probably went back to Denver. You lied to her family, her friends. You left us in the dark. Roy nodded, tears falling onto his collar. I did. Andrew looked at the bracelet, his sister's name shining faintly. She trusted you, and you broke her. There was no shouting, no fists, just silence, thick and final. Nate took the evidence bags and closed them gently. This doesn't end here, he said. There's a process. You'll answer for this. Roy didn't resist. I know. As the snow began falling harder outside, Nate led Andrew into the hallway. Echo followed, silent as shadow. Behind them, Roy remained seated at the table, his head bowed in hands that had once held a badge. The snow in Snow Ridge finally softened. After weeks of hard frost and biting wind, the clouds thinned, letting pale sunlight spill across the town like a quiet forgiveness. Tree limbs sagged under the weight of old snow, melting into slow, steady drops. The chill remained, but it no longer bit, just lingered. Roy Hensley was taken into custody 2 days after the confession. There was no resistance, no public denial. He walked out of the station in silence, hands cuffed behind his back, head bowed, his badge left behind on the desk he once ruled with unshakable confidence. It had taken 12 years, but Melissa Kane's voice had finally broken through the walls built around her silence. Nate Carter sat alone in his office that morning, the pale sun casting lines of light through the frosted window. Echo lay near the door, stretched out, eyes closed, but not asleep. A badge with a new tag lay on the desk beside Nate, Canine Honor Dog, engraved in clean brass beneath Echo's name. They had called it a commendation, but Nate knew better. It wasn't just a formality. Echo had done what no officer could. He listened to something no one else could hear, and he refused to let it be ignored. Instinct had become evidence. Grief had become justice. The department had allowed Nate to rewrite the official report from beginning to end. Every missed note, every closed door, every piece of evidence hidden away, he documented it all. No more insufficient evidence. No more archived files. Just truth, laid bare on paper. A week later, the town gathered under a wide canvas awning beside the Snow Ridge Community Chapel. Snow was shoveled back into neat banks, and paths were lined with evergreen sprigs and lanterns that flickered in the soft winter light. Melissa Kane was buried properly this time, her remains retrieved, identified, and honored. She was 20 when she died. She would never be older. But on that day, she was remembered not just as a victim, but as a person, a daughter, a sister, a young woman with poems in her notebooks and starlight in her eyes. Andrew stood by the casket, hands tucked into the sleeves of a black wool coat, the same red scarf from the photograph wrapped around his neck. He didn't cry during the service. His face was still, carved like stone. But when Echo walked past him after the ceremony, the dog paused, then pressed his head gently against Andrew's knee. Andrew dropped a hand to his fur. She'd have liked you, he said. You listen better than most people. That evening, back at the station, Carla Monroe handed Nate a white envelope with faint purple handwriting across the front, to Officer Carter and Echo. Inside was a folded card and a letter. The handwriting wavered, but the words were full of warmth. Dear Officer Carter, I don't know how to begin to thank you. For years, I held on to the hope that someone, somewhere, would still care enough to ask what happened to my daughter. You did more than ask. You listened. And Echo, that dog. He found her. People say animals don't speak, but they do. They speak with their hearts, and if we're lucky, we learn to understand. You understood him, and because of that my Melissa finally rests. Thank you for giving her voice back to the world. With all my heart, Evelyn Kane. Nate folded the letter slowly, breath caught somewhere between pride and sorrow. Echo nudged his elbow gently, sensing the shift in emotion like he always did. Nate reached down, scratched behind his ears. You hear more than any of us ever will, he whispered. You knew before any of us were willing to look. Echo looked up, tail beginning to move, once, twice, then again. Nate laughed softly. First time I've seen you wag that tail without someone holding a stake. The tail wagged again. Outside, Snow Ridge's winter began to lift. The silence that had cloaked the town for 12 years finally broke, not with sirens or shouts, but with the steady sound of melting snow and the footsteps of a dog who refused to stop listening. And in the station, beneath soft light and quiet breaths, a man and a dog sat together, not as officer and canine, but as two beings who had carried justice up a mountain, over frozen roofs, and into the heart of a town that had almost forgotten how to remember. Sometimes justice doesn't come from loud voices or flashing lights. Sometimes it comes from a whisper or a bark. It comes from a loyal heart, a silent companion, a dog who sees what others choose to ignore. In this story, Echo wasn't just a canine. He was a guardian sent to guide the truth back into the light. Maybe it wasn't just instinct. Maybe it was something greater. Maybe God, in his mysterious grace, chose to speak through the one creature that couldn't lie. A dog with no words, but with unwavering purpose. Because when humans turn away from pain, he sends something pure to lead us back. This story is a reminder that no silence is too deep for God to hear. No injustice is too old for him to uncover. And sometimes the miracle we need doesn't come in thunder, but in the soft sound of pause and the stillness of eyes that refuse to look away. So if this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Comment your thoughts. Subscribe if you believe stories like this deserve to be told. And most importantly, type AMN in the comments if you believe God still works through the small, the silent, and the loyal. May He bless and protect you and your loved ones always.